Tower of Babel, in biblical literature, structure built in the land of Shinar, Babylonia some time after the deluge. The story of its construction, given in Genesis 11:1-9, appears to be an attempt to explain the existence of diverse human languages. According to Genesis, the Babylonians wanted to make a name for themselves by building a mighty city and a tower with its top in the heavens. God disrupted the work by so confusing the language of the workers that they could no longer understand one another. The city was never completed, and the people were dispersed over the face of the earth. The myth may have been inspired by the Babylonian Tower Temple north of the Marduk Temple, which in Babylonian was called Babel, Gate of God, Hebrew form Babel, or Babel. The similarity in pronunciation of Babel and Belial to confuse led to the play on words in Genesis 11:9. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. This cultural heritage was adopted by the Sumerians and Akkadian successors, the Amorites, a western Semitic tribe that had conquered all of Mesopotamia by about 1900 BC. Under the rule of the Amorites, which lasted until about 1600 BC, Babylon became the political and commercial center of the Tigris-Euphrates area, and Babylonia became a great empire, encompassing all of southern Mesopotamia and part of Assyria to the north. The ruler largely responsible for this rise to power was Hammurabi c. 1790–1750 BC, the sixth king of the first dynasty of Babylon, who forged coalitions between the separate city-states, promoted science and scholarship, and promulgated his famous code of law. After Hammurabi's death, the Babylonian Empire declined until 1595 BC, when the Hittite invader Mursil I unseated the Babylonian king Samsudatana, allowing the Kassites from the mountains east of Babylonia to assume power and establish a dynasty that lasted for 100 years. During the last few centuries of Kassite rule, religion and literature flourished in Babylonia, the most important literary work of the period being the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation. During this same time, however, Assyria broke away from Babylonian control and developed as an independent empire, threatening the Kassite dynasty in Babylonia and on a few occasions temporarily gaining control. Elam, too, grew powerful and ultimately conquered most of Babylonia, felling the Kassite dynasty c. 1157 BC. In a series of wars, a new line of Babylonian kings, the second dynasty of the city of Isin, was established. Its most outstanding member, Nebuchadrezzar I, reigned 1119–1098 BC, defeated Elam and successfully fought off Assyrian advances for some years. For several centuries following Nebuchadrezzar's rule, a three-way struggle developed among the Assyrians and Aramean and Chaldean tribesmen for control of Babylonia, from the 9th century to the fall of the Assyrian Empire in the late 7th century BC. Assyrian kings most frequently ruled over Babylonia, often appointing sub-kings to administer the government. The last ruling Assyrian king was Ashurbanipal, who fought a civil war against his brother, the sub-king in Babylon, devastating the city and its population. Upon Ashurbanipal's death, a Chaldean leader, Nabopolassar, made Babylon his capital and instituted the last and greatest period of Babylonian supremacy. His son Nebuchadrezzar II reigned 605–560 BC, conquered Syria and Palestine. He is best remembered for the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem in 587 BC and for the ensuing Babylonian captivity of the Jews. He also revitalized Babylon, constructing the wondrous Hanging Gardens and rebuilding the Temple of Marduk and its accompanying ziggurat. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, captured Babylonia from Nebuchadrezzar's last successor Nabonidus in 539 BC. Thereafter, Babylonia ceased to be independent, passing eventually in 331 BC to Alexander the Great, who planned to make Babylon the capital of his empire and who died in Nebuchadrezzar's palace. After Alexander's death, however, the Seleucids eventually abandoned Babylon, bringing an end to one of the greatest empires in history. The later biblical tradition of the Tower at Babel, Genesis 11:1-9, exemplifies three aspects of early thought about language: 1. Divine interest in and control over its use and development; 2. A recognition of the power it gives to humans in relation to their environment; and 3. An explanation of linguistic diversity, of the fact that people in adjacent communities speak different and mutually unintelligible languages, together with a survey of the various speech communities of the world, known at the time to the Hebrew people. The origin of language has never failed to provide a subject for speculation, and its inaccessibility adds to its fascination. Informed investigations of the probable conditions under which language might have originated and developed are seen in the late 18th century essay of the German philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder, Abhandlung über den Ursprung der Sprache, essay on the origin of language, and in numerous other treatments. But people have tried to go farther, to discover or to reconstruct something like the actual forms and structure of the first language. This lies forever beyond the reach of science, in that spoken language in some form is almost certainly coeval with Homo sapiens. The earliest records of written language, the only linguistic fossils humanity can hope to have, go back no more than 4,000 to 5,000 years. Some people have tried to claim that the cries of animals and birds, or non-lexical expressions of excitement or anger, evolved into human speech, as if onomatopoeia were the essence of language. These claims have been ridiculed for their inadequacy by, for example, the Oxford philologist Max Muller in the 19th century, and have been given nicknames such as boa and poo-poo theories. On several occasions attempts have been made to identify one particular existing language as representing the original or oldest tongue of humankind. But, in fact, the universal process of linguistic change rules out any such hopes from the start. When people have begun to reflect on language, its relation to thinking becomes a central concern. Several cultures have independently viewed the main function of language as the expression of thought. Ancient Indian grammarians speak of the soul apprehending things with the intellect and inspiring the mind with a desire to speak. And in the Greek intellectual tradition, Aristotle declared, speech is the representation of the experiences of the mind on interpretation. Such an attitude passed into Latin theory, and thence into medieval doctrine. Medieval grammarians envisaged 3 stages in the speaking process. Things in the world exhibit properties. These properties are understood by the minds of humans, and, in the manner in which they have been understood, so they are communicated to others by the resources of language. Rationalist writers on language in the 17th century gave essentially a similar account. Speaking is expressing thoughts by signs invented for the purpose, and words of different classes. The different parts of speech came into being to correspond to the different aspects of thinking. Such a view of language continued to be accepted as generally adequate and gave rise to the sort of definition proposed by Henry Sui and quoted above. The main objection to it is that it either gives so wide an interpretation to thought as virtually to empty the word of any specific content, or gives such a narrow interpretation of language as to exclude a great deal of normal usage. A recognition of the part played by speaking and writing in social cooperation in everyday life has highlighted the many and varied functions of language in all cultures. Apart from the functions strictly involved in the communication of thought, which had been the main focus of attention for those who approached language from the standpoint of the philosopher, to allow for the full range of language used by speakers, more comprehensive definitions of language have been proposed on the lines of the second one quoted at the beginning of this article, namely, a language is a system of arbitrary vocal symbols, by means of which a social group cooperates. Despite the breadth of this definition, however, its use of the word vocal excludes all languages that are not vocalized, particularly manual sign languages.